Today, I'm talking with Odessa Aviana Perez. She is a somatic psychotherapist, embodiment and social justice educator with a master's in somatic psychology from California Institute of Integral Studies, and with over 2 decades of dance and contact improv experience. Her mission is to help folks heal trauma and find belonging and right relationship through deeper embodiment. She offers workshops and retreats throughout California and internationally, weaving relational learning with movement exploration and social justice frameworks. She has a psychotherapy private practice based in Los Angeles, aka Keats Tongva Land. She is the inclusion and belonging co-lead for Soul Play Festivals, which is where I met her. Welcome, Odessa. It is such a pleasure to chat with you today.
So
Hmm,
great to be here,
so
Jaclyn. Thanks for having me.
Hmm. I want to jump right in with this concept of right relationship, which is so central to your work, both, interpersonal and also these macro level issues that you help folks grapple with. So, what is right relationship? How are we not in right relationship in various areas of our life?
Jumping right in. So, right relationship is a term I learned. It's an indigenous term that means to be in, I guess the best word for it is symbiotic relationship with our surroundings and with each other. A relationship that's mutually beneficial and recognizes that we need each other and that the needing is not a weakness, but actually a strength. Uh, Capitalistic colonizer mindset would have us believe really otherwise. The rugged individualism that this country was founded upon and the colonial extraction mindset that this country was founded upon um, really seeps into all of our layers of existence, all the way down to how we relate to each other interpersonally. And so in my work, I'm looking at how we are out of right relationship with the land and with each other and with ourselves, and how there's healing needed to have us restore that right relationship on all of these different layers of being a human.
Mm, wow. I'm wondering if you could go layer by layer how we're not in right relationship. Because immediately, as soon as like, ideas came for each one, and starting with ourselves.
Yeah. Well, our relationship with ourselves from a psychological attachment level perspective, it's inextricably linked with our relationship with others. Our personalities, our ways of being in the world are developed through our primary caretaker relationships um, from when we're infants and children. And so it's hard to talk about just the self and our out of right relationship with the self without talking about those core relationships and how they shape us. Um, you know, uh, all attachment trauma and other kinds of developmental trauma are inherently out of right relationship. The way in which um, our parents cared for us and either responded to our needs or weren't able to, or judged our needs or made them seem unrealistic or not okay. Like all of those ways that our parents took care of us in the beginning kind of shape our reality of like our right to life, our right to our own boundaries, our right to our own needs, our right to our own autonomy, our right to our own feelings of sense of safety and connection. And these are all just kind of the core principles of attachment. It's establishing a safe enough sense in order to feel able to go towards what you're curious about and explore, and that's where that feeling for sovereignty comes. And so in those early attachment relationships, depending on how our caregivers responded to us, we can either develop and this is oversimplifying, of course, but we can either develop hypervigilance or fixation on safety and not feeling safe, or on the desire to feel sovereign and on autonomous. And these show up later on in life in our personal relationships. And as a couples therapist, I see this all the time, this push pull dynamic. If you're familiar with attachment theory, the anxious avoidant trap is what, some pop psychology books like to
Mm-hmm.
call it. And it's inherently this fight, this struggle of how do I in myself find right relationship with my needs and boundaries and feel safe enough to express them to another and be authentic with another with those. So this like right relationship piece is happening at this core level of safety and autonomy. And that and how we feel about safety and autonomy and how we've experienced that as a culture and um, how different layers of systemic oppression have influenced us based on our identities around our experiences of safety and autonomy. Those are all existing at the same time as these attachment interpersonal layers are also existing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like it's not just what happens in the home, but also how all those layers of society, of kind of like the ecological framework influence us. And of course, for some people, it's like this hmm, yeah, I want to ask you, but this sort of like grasping of like maybe I can't be in right relationship with myself, so I overly need others versus that like that hyper individualist because it's not safe to be in right relationship with others.
Exactly, yeah. And all of that is at its core the way that I see it, and other people may see it differently, but at its core it really is this dance and this exploration of needs and boundaries, right? Like, do I feel like I have a right to have boundaries? Do I feel like my needs matter, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and when you had originally brought up right relationship with ourselves, where my brain went is this sort of idea of like listening to our body and honoring it. So if our body's saying, "Hey, I'm really tired," do we rest or
Mhm.
do we have another cup of coffee? And like, what is,
Mhm.
are we overly identified with the relationship to productivity as, being worthy? And sort of like, can we have the boundary of saying, I need to take a half sick day or I need to lighten my load today or whatever it
Right,
looks like.
right.
And yet, to your point, it's like that's not just actually a relationship with self; it's a relationship with culture and
Exactly.
these macro level things.
Right. It's a relationship with a capitalistic culture that rewards this so-called productivity as being synonymous with your worth, really, right? And like money being so tied to your worth and value, that it not only is it hard to listen to the voice that's like, I need to rest or I need to take a half day. Sometimes the somatic entrainment that would even tell you what you need is not developed or is underdeveloped,
Hmm.
right? This like I asked on a Facebook post a couple months ago, like, what's the number one thing that is keeping you from taking better care of yourself or tending to your self growth? And it was so many people were like this external validation of the world that tells me I have to keep going. And
Hmm.
that external validation, that can be with a culture, that can be with a partner, right? That like, and external validation in and of itself is not a bad thing. We are social creatures, so we actually do need a certain level of like,
Yeah.
is this acceptable? Like, am I going to get kicked out of the tribe if like I don't, right? Like, there's a certain amount of that that's just baked in. But if it's not countered with this internal validation, this internal sense of oh, that's what I need, like that knowing of that's what I need, then
Hmm.
that's where burnout can happen and depletion and resentment and all kinds of things.
Yeah, yeah. And to go back to, I think the idea of like symbiotic, which of course, I think most of us, we think about that in terms of nature and not realizing that everything is ideally, I mean, we are nature, but, ideally everything has a symbiotic relationship, that it's sort of like, and maybe this isn't quite how it works, but if a tree doesn't have enough resources, it doesn't give to others, it actually might let itself receive resources. And yet, what do? We just keep going and keep going and keep going. And it's like, it's no fault of our own because that internal signal has been pushed down because of what the dominant culture says is normal and what you need to do to have those external validation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's that cultural level. And then there's, as you were talking, I was thinking about in Hakomi, there's something called a nourishment barrier. Hakomi is a somatic
Mm,
um, counseling modality. And uh, there's this concept nourishment barrier, which is like I have learned how to go without the nourishment I need for so long that when it's actually here in front of me, I don't know how to receive it. And nourishment barriers show up for a variety of different reasons and show up in different ways for different folks. But this is why one of the core principles of somatic work is about resourcing and about what makes you feel well, what makes you feel okay, what makes you feel regulated. And that's not a weakness. And I have to struggle with some of my clients around that, right? Because the capitalistic culture of like, and the Protestant ethic of like, I have to suffer in this lifetime is so ingrained that like
mhm.
being kind to one's body and oneself is like mind blowing, you know? But in actuality, when we take the time to create that space for gentleness and kindness and rest and really checking in with what we need in our bodies, we're actually expanding our foundation. And with that expanded foundation, we can actually show up more courageously. We have more in our stores to combat, heal, and integrate trauma. We have more capacity to show up resiliently in stressful situations. And this is
Mhm.
so antithetical to our culture that it is something I spend a lot of time with a lot of clients. They're like, no, you deserve the rest. And it's literally part of your humanity to find that state of well-being.
Yeah. Every living thing needs to rest. And why would we be any different? Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Exactly.
I know that using embodiment to help folks essentially grapple with white supremacy as part of your work. And we haven't fully
Hmm.
named it, but it's certainly influencing all the things we're talking about. So, can you talk a little bit
Hmm.
about right relationship and white supremacy? Are like, yeah, I'll open that up.
Yeah.
Just
So
a light question.
for this conversation, I really want to lean on somebody I've learned a lot from, which is Resmaa Menakem, who authored the book My Grandmother's Hands, which I read in grad school and straight up changed my life. And I got to meet him recently and really thank him for that. Um,
Mm,
and so Resmaa Menakem is a Black somatic psychotherapist based out of Minneapolis. He was doing anti-racist trainings um, in the Minneapolis Police Department before George Floyd happened. And so, like, he's an OG. It's a straight
yeah.
up OG with like a lot of on the ground experience with this and lived experience. And his book is around Black body, white body, and police body trauma. And the way that he has approached the the racial reckoning that is happening right now and that has been, you know, boiling under the surface for centuries and is at this level of reckoning now, he's framing it as a trauma problem.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that really opened me to find the resilience to do my own work around the part of my lineage that is European and has participated in white supremacy. Part of what gave me the resilience to do that was the understanding that, oh, this is a trauma response. This fragility, what Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility, is actually a lack of resilience in the nervous system to deal with something that privilege has allowed us to not have to confront. But
Mm-hmm.
the real truth of it is that this is what Resma says that I very much believe, is that, you know, Europeans were able to colonize and enslave other humans because that had happened to them and that trauma was living in their bodies. Right. And so, because if you think about it, like what creates that monstrosity, what creates that
Yeah.
just total disconnect from other people's humanity?
Mm-hmm.
Trauma. Right. So um I
Mm-hmm.
have a mixed cultural background of European colonizers, Spanish colonizers who lived in Puerto Rico for hundreds of years, and Taino, which is indigenous Puerto Rican lineage. And so I have I believe I have a lived experience of what white supremacy has done on both sides in my own body. And if white folk actually track and trace their lineage back far enough, we all have it because all of us had our indigeneity stripped at one time or another.
Yep. Yep.
Mine just happens to be a little bit sooner on the timeline, a little bit more recent on the timeline. And I witnessed and experienced the sort of aftermath of racism and how it impacted my grandparents' generation, my father's generation in New York City in the 40s and 50s, and as Puerto Rican transplants, and so it's closer in to me the kind of necessities that they chose in order to survive under white supremacy. The sort of, I'm going to assimilate, I'm going to lose the language, I'm going to lose all of the culture and just become white because I can pass as white. I have that appearance and that's what's going to get me
Mm-hmm.
ahead. And the, as I've done my own healing and somatic inquiry in myself, I can feel the layers of the intergenerational trauma of shame of who I am
Mm.
that has been like unconsciously just sort of passed down in the DNA. And also, I'm not just gonna like hang in the negative there, also like the incredible resilience and strength that my grandparents had to have to leave Puerto Rico from a farming existence when they were teenagers and become business owners in New York City. You know, that strength and
Mm.
that resilience is in me too. And the grief of the loss of what they traded that for and then what I lose because of that. It's
Yeah.
complicated. It's both.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of complexity there. Oh, I tear easily, so I'm feeling that. Like I'm feeling that. I'm feeling you. And there's a quote that oh gosh, I used to like have it baked in me, but it's um Paulo Freire, and it's basically about like, if we're just looking to kind of gain more power within a system, we will become the oppressor. We will shed our identities or our ways of being to gain power in a system because that's what it looks like. It's like, well, if I just have the money, if I just have the the different immigration status or whatever it is. And so when I hear you talking about like if you go far back enough, it's like
Hmm.
some of our ancestors, they might be oppressed in one decade, one year, one, but where does that come from? And
Yeah.
versus real liberation is changing that structure, kind of being like, what if I didn't have to pick that path? Which of course is not as easy, said and done. But I do think it's, when our only idea of power is power over and
Hmm.
not power with, then
Hmm.
of course our ancestors might have contributed to some of these,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's simple but not easy, right? And I think that this is like
Yeah.
that, like rewiring the oppressive structures is a really tall order. Will we get it done in time for like to not fully destroy the human race? I don't know. But I do think that trauma healing is core to us being able to figure it out.
Well, there's two paths we could go down. Of course, I'm so curious about this concept of the resilient body and all that that means, how fragility shows up, what this real trauma healing looks like. But also, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey to this work. You shared kind of your ancestors' stories, a little bit of,
Mhm.
we've been teased with your own. So curious which path you want to go down in this moment.
I'm I'm feeling like the personal story because I think that it will sort of help frame out the work that I've
Yeah.
shown up to do. Um, so I think when I think about my uh main influences in my life, I think about the fact that my parents met in a Sufi community in England in the 70s, um, which is like seemed like a really wild place. And there's a community of people all over the world still, and there's us Sufi kids who are like the kind of second generation of people who were born from the people who are in this community. And so I had an understanding of community from a really young age. I didn't grow up there, but I would go to the retreat center very often as a kid and as a teenager. And I had a ton of adult mentors around me and who were thinking outside the box. And so I think that that really like established a core value of community for me from a very young age. Um, and then in college, I was a community organizer with a group called Tent State University for 8 years. And we developed a what we called a revolutionary democratic model of organizing that actually spread around the country a little bit and is actually we don't have any roots with Occupy Wall Street, but when Occupy Wall Street happened in 2011, that's what we were doing back in 2003. And it's kind of that zeitgeist, right? Like that spirit of
Hmm.
things. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what we were up to. And so I was involved in community organizing and in we weren't calling it social justice back then, but in that kind of work from like my 20s on. And I got really, really disheartened. We ran a citywide election in New Brunswick, New Jersey. I went to Rutgers University for my undergrad, and we ran a citywide election campaign to change how the city council was elected so that it was more representational of the Black and Latino communities that lived in New Brunswick. And we lost that campaign by 9 votes.
Mm.
And I don't think that they played fair on the other side. And after that, that was 2009, I walked away from social justice work, from political work. I was just like, this is exhausting. I cannot do this. And then I went into like healing work and found theta healing and found the power of, changing our belief systems and how that can change our lives. And I really changed my life in a big way. That brought me to California and to exploring more of this sort of spiritual, new agey, like woo woo culture that is still really near and dear to my heart. and I have evolved to have some criticisms of. Um, and I went to grad school after a traumatic event happened to me, and I realized that the way that I was approaching healing work was missing this huge piece. After I experienced a trauma, I was like, oh my God, this is trauma? This is insane. This is so intense. And I need to know more about this so that I can, And so in this way, it was like all of these different streams kind of led me to be a somatic therapist. I was also a dancer for years. I was a dance major in college and ran a dance company in Jersey City. And, so all of these paths kind of led me here to start to hash out how the body is the central place that all of this change can happen, and how trauma thwarts our ability to dream and create and be curious, and how we need each other to do this work, right? Like my roots in community in the beginning, it's like we cannot do this work in a vacuum. We need each other. And one of my kind of loving critiques of the spiritual new age festival culture that I am a part of, that has been hugely influential in my life for the last 20 years. One of my critiques of it is that it's fulfilling this longing that we all have for community, but it's temporary community. And therefore, it is not allowing us to dig in and learn how to do the hard things together. And that is the bottom line, I think, of what is missing in all of
Hmm.
the love and light woo woo culture that I affectionately like still have a toe in, you know?
Yep. Wow. I resonate with so much of that, but especially what you just named. And I think for me, that was part of why San Francisco, I had to say goodbye to, because I was longing for community and I did so much to like root in and try to build that community. And it felt like, oh, y'all want to be together for the ecstasy and y'all want that authentic relating that happens real deep, but is nothing afterwards. It's like a one night stand of authenticity. And you guys want the essentially the commodified wellness version of this work, and yet when it comes to the day to day, no one's really willing to show up for each other because most of you can afford to Uber Eats, most of you can afford to order your groceries, most of you don't need to really lean on others. So it's much more about like, let's come and drink our tea and talk about this thing, but like we're not in it together. And that's what I yearn for, and also that's what I know is what we need. And what
Mm-hmm.
like what is going to create a new world is like, how do we really show up, especially since these systems that we can try to reform, but usually it doesn't work even when it does. It's like, and I think we learned that with COVID is like there's only so much the government is going to actually do for us. And so how do we show up for each other? And God love some of those spaces, and I'm grateful for the gifts. And, it's like I felt this like there's something more, and like yes, it's so ephemeral, and but what about all those other layers of my life, and where are you guys there?
Yeah, well said. I totally agree. And we can really see all the layers again, right? It's like we don't know how to show up for the hard stuff. We're not trained in conflict resolution and rupture and repair processes. Like I'm constantly teaching my couples how to fight better, Um, and you know, there's this extractive quality, this commodified quality. This is the real kind of essence underneath, or one of the essences underneath um people calling in about cultural appropriation, right? It's like it's because there is this longing that Western culture, that people in the States, I'll say in particular, have for meaning and for ritual and for things that are like like deeper in, right? but there's no frame of reference for how to hold it in a good way. So
Hmm.
we because we're living under colonizer mentality and capitalism, unless we're really thinking about it and deprogramming these things in ourselves, our go-to way is to extract something, commodify it, and and dilute it down. And when
Yep.
we dilute it down, it becomes this sort of surface level of like of how even just like thinking, like your thoughts are, you know, made manifest, being distilled down to good vibes only, which is like one of the
Hmm.
most violent toxic statements. Like I just can't stand that statement, right? It's like it's actually violent to just completely deny and exclude the mess, the hardship, the difficulty, the hard feelings, the conflict from our human experience. It's part of our human experience. We are on this plane. Earth is no joke, okay? Like if we want to go meta dimensional here, like this plane is really hard. This planet, like all of us who incarnated on this timeline on this planet, like I just want to give us all a round of applause for showing up. Like it's hard here,
Hmm.
but there's a reason for us to explore that, like that richness of human experience that includes all of that, you know. um One of the things that I learned in grad school, um which like the light bulb turned on and I was like, thank you, that's the thing. And I think it was my professor Marcia Hiller, who shared this with us, that, you know, so somatic psychotherapy is relatively new. I think it started developing in like the 80s or something along that timeline. And um Marcia was saying that catharsis was this new thing in the 60s and 70s that people were exploring, right? Okay, so we're having these rage workshops, or we're having these like learning how to scream, or we're having these like big like emotive processes that are bringing us into a different state of consciousness that it was believed was healing or was supportive or was helpful. And then as somatics became more of a thing, and as trauma informed care became more of a thing, we realized that catharsis doesn't stick around. it
Hmm.
it's like a valve that like lets off steam, but it doesn't integrate the feelings or the trauma for us. Trauma integration is a different thing, and it's not about like totally blowing our lid and losing consciousness in some state of ecstasy or big emotion. It's actually about staying one foot resourced, one
Hmm.
piece in the body, and integrating the experiences. And if we're not
Hmm.
integrating these big experiences, then there's not actually any big change happening. And
Yep.
I'm not going to speak for like everyone or all the dance communities or anything, but I do think that there is a big kernel of truth here for the new age dance communities that you and I are a part of, that are, you know, like the quote unquote conscious dance communities. I think were really born out of this catharsis movement. And these dance communities have been hugely influential and like a place of my own becoming, and I'm forever grateful for them. And so I'm not saying anything bad about that catharsis. I've had plenty of moments where I'm like, wow, I really needed that, and like I feel different now and I can go about my day. I'm a little bit more in my body.
Hmm.
But on the whole, the movement has kind of, I think, unconsciously clung to this good vibes only, this catharsis centric, this focus on the expansive, and all of, and continually expanding, just want the expansive feelings, and has no way of being with the contraction. Like
Hmm.
foundationally, structurally, these dances don't hold a place for the contraction. They don't hold a place for communities to come and talk together and be like, this isn't working for me because this, and this, right? There's like nothing baked in that is allowing us to be in the hard work, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think that's true of all the dances, and I don't think that I'm the only one who's thinking about this, but I do
No.
think that that is one of the problems we are running into in this new age culture that really means well and really like wants this progression of our consciousness and wants and understands the power of embodiment and dance, but is missing this core really important piece. We cannot leave our trauma behind. We cannot leave our dark parts behind or our shadow behind. How do we dance with that? How do we be with that
Hmm.
and include that?
Hmm. Oh my God. Plus 1,000 to everything you just said. And as you were saying that, my brain also was like, this also applies for breath work, which I think is an area that I felt a little like, hey, like, yes, there's powerful alchemy, and yes, you can really move some stuff that might feel deep within, but that's it's not the only way, and it's also not sufficient in and of itself from where I'm standing. And for many people, it can
Mm-hmm.
actually be re-traumatizing or profoundly dysregulating to only do the cathartic work without that resourcing that you talked about, without that nourishment, without that integration afterward, without being deeply held in your experience, even if your experience wasn't like, oh my God, and I had this and now I feel so much better, and like, and how you can feel perhaps even more broken if that's
Mm-hmm.
not your experience. And yes,
Mm-hmm.
these types of tools have their place, but it's often within a broader web, a broader framework, and being deeply held. And so much of my work is often the small tender parts. It's like, oh, let's put your hands on your heart and like let's hold that part. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's often the baby step needed before you can have that profound catharsis. And yet, going back to, yeah, kind of like right relations with our body, I think for often when folks are like, okay, I want to heal, it's like, well, I have to do it fast, I have to do it hard, I have to do it big, and it's not working unless it's all of those things. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, oof, and that's, ugh.
Nothing's further from the truth, actually. And I mean, I get that a lot. Like, I work with quite a bit of attachment trauma and sexual assault trauma in my private practice. And, um, there's like, and like, why wouldn't there be? There's like this desire to just like get it off, get it out. Like, I don't want to, like, right? And of course, it's so tremendously challenging
Mhm.
to even begin to learn how to be with the atrocious things that have happened to us, you know? And so a lot like that's again the resourcing, like building that capacity to be with what's hard. And one of the things I love saying in my private practice is like the somatic work is slow, but it's slow because sometimes it's just like that.
Yep.
Something will
Yep.
shift just like that. But you have to go slow to have that shift happen. In the words
Absolutely.
of
It's
Bio
all the layers.
Kumalafe, yeah, one of my other favorite thinkers these days, Bio Kumalafe says, times are urgent, we must slow down.
Mm. Things are urgent. We must slow down. Yeah. Yeah. The fastest way to get where you want to go is to slow down.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. The somatic paradox.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've touched on this, and everything you've said mentally for me has touched on this of the idea of what is a resilient body, what is a fragile body.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So, from the nervous system perspective, a resilient nervous system is one that can move in and out of different nervous system states with ease. So that means that it can move from regulation, also called the social engagement system, or the ventral vagal part, which if you're wanting to be a polyvagal nerd, that those are the terms. Um, so moving from that regulated place to dysregulation that happens in stressful moments, either, the fight and flight in the sympathetic nervous system, or the freeze and collapse that happens in the dorsal vagal system, that we make use of all of these different nervous system states, of the mobilized states and the immobilized states throughout our day, really. And that moving through these states, getting triggered mildly or otherwise, like, that's not a bad thing. In fact, being able to move through those states and come back to a state of whatever your regulated state is, that's resilience from the nervous system
Mhm.
perspective. So what does that mean for, so then what's fragile?
Mhm.
um you know this is a complicated question. Okay, the first thing I'm thinking about is I have a really dear friend um who lives in a mountain town that I used to live in. um and I went and I lived in this mountain town for 2 years after my traumatic event happened, and needed like needed the mountain vibes to heal my nervous system, and like it took me a full 7 months to reset and feel settled. And then I just had a really beautiful time feeling connected in community and being in a beautiful mountain town. And then eventually I moved back to the city and went to grad school and blah blah blah. And this mountain town, when George Floyd happened, and the Black Lives Matter movement really started picking up pace, the community that me and my friend were both a part of really started to show its true colors, of a lot of under the surface racism started to emerge from some folks. And it was heartbreaking, and it was shocking, and it was oh, but also of course, it was and a lot of this kind of really a lot of really intense conversations erupted, on Facebook and otherwise. And um, a lot of defensiveness showed up, which is part and parcel with what Robin DiAngelo talks about in terms of white fragility and being confronted with privilege and white supremacy, and what the body and nervous system does with that. All this defense, right? That can be quite aggressive at times. And my friend asked me, we were on the phone talking about it one day, and she was like, I don't understand why, we all live in this beautiful mountain town. We have all of this nature as resource. We are regulated all the time. We feel good all the time. Why, when this stuff comes, like, do we go 0 to 60? Do people just totally blow their lids and get really defensive and really into their sympathetic or whatever? And I was like, because they're not used to it, because they're used to being in this everything is perfect, everything is okay, everything is fine place. And I'm entitled, that starts to come in there, unconsciously, I'm
Mhm.
entitled to this level of comfort, that when
Mhm.
something uncomfortable, and honestly, I feel like calling it discomfort is half the story, because it's actually triggering really deep old trauma, as we already discussed, right?
Yep.
So when this discomfort comes in, when this questioning of your right to that level of comfort comes in, there's nothing in the body and nervous system that knows how to handle it, because you've just been in this cool place where your survival hasn't been threatened, your right to life hasn't been threatened, your right to your identity hasn't been threatened, right? And so a little thing, a not so little thing, but a an actually not threatening, not dangerous thing, a question that's being
Mhm.
asked, is then interpreted by a nervous system that is not prepared, hasn't been in the practice of it. Whoop, That's fragility. When our nervous system doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the lived experience, doesn't have the know-how to be in a stressful situation, right?
Mhm.
And on the other hand, like, this is where it gets complicated around like what access to safety you had depending on your identity and depending on where you grew up and where you live and all of that, right? And like the other side of the coin that I want to touch on that I think gets misrepresented sometimes is, you know, Black and brown communities that have lived in, you know, dangerous circumstances and have had to like live under a constant state of threat and had to build that resilience and had to maybe stay in chronic states of um, fight, flight, or freeze, right? And then they get called resilient, and it's like, oh, okay, white people are fragile and people of color are resilient, and it's like, but also that's not fair to anybody. And like, resilient at the cost of what? And are we like calling these folks resilient so that we can like make it okay systemically that this is happening, you know? Right?
Mhm.
So there's just, and I've heard folks talk about this aspect of like resilience being used as an excuse. And so I want to be really clear that I'm not doing that, and that
Yeah.
my focus here is around like, can we understand the fragility, the like as a defense mechanism that needs support in order for people to deal with anything that's hard. We're talking about race right now, but like, again, this is where the layers are. There's relational aspects to it, right? Um,
Mhm.
I can talk about in terms of gender roles too. Like, you know, the internet likes to talk about weaponized incompetence. I don't know if you've heard this whole thing around
Mhm.
men in heterosexual relationships having like weaponized incompetence. And I think the vast majority of those men are maybe not conscious of it. They've just like had a lack of education experience, like, right? And it's a cultural issue. It's how we've acculturated men and boys, you know? And so it's like, and I have some dear male friends that I've called in about this and been like, I want to be in relationship with you around this because, like, we all, nobody wins under patriarchy. Like, it's not, I know you don't love feeling incompetent here, you know? So I think it's like, can we just kind of look at how our nervous systems have organized around our life experience that has been very much influenced by our identities? And can we be kind with each other about like how we heal that up and how we transform, like our nervous systems are adaptable and changeable. So we can change
Yep.
all of this.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's so much there. Thank you for that nuance. Thank you. And yeah, I want to,
Yeah.
plus one, the whole calling a group, calling an individual resilient when what they really had was a lack of fucking options. It's like they had to deal
Yeah.
with the cards that were dealt. And,
Yeah.
post-traumatic growth is real, but also let's not use that as a way to kind of excuse what happened and also what didn't happen and resources that weren't there and oppression that shouldn't exist. And,
Yeah.
what's interesting is, yes, it's sort of like I do think a lot of white people are able to, and people who just have privilege in different ways, which of course can mean you don't have privilege in some
Mhm.
ways and you do in others, but you can kind of have this like faux resilience, like you were saying, which is I can be regulated as long as I don't have to face this hard shit that I'm privileged, that I have the privilege within this system of. And then as soon as I do, it's too much. Or like, okay, I'll deal with it, but I'm gonna have so much grief over this that I'm gonna then make other people do labor for me. And I'm maybe not able to process it and hold it myself or with the appropriate people. And that can still be a level of fragility. And just, this is something I want to do an episode on is, there's the concept of allostatic load, which is like this. nervous system kind of essentially the effects of chronic dysregulation, that fight or
Yeah.
flight or that freeze. And um, the differences in this by racial groups has been well studied, and it
Yes.
starts off at a very young age and it just grows and grows and grows over the lifetime, and it contributes to heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, like all of
Yep.
these real health conditions, and then premature death. And so, yes, a group can be resilient because they had to be, and there's real wear and tear on the system because it's working so hard in order to thrive or just survive within the system. Um,
Exactly.
so those are a few things I wanted to sort of add in.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I love the you bringing in the science about the Allstott load and the different groups because my brain like thinks about those things or receives those things and I can never repeat them. So I love that you've got that like on the ready.
Yeah, it's I was recent just aside. I was recently in St. Louis, where I'm from, and helping my mom. She's in the process of selling her home, and I have all these books from college there, which she's lovingly had for a while. And one of them was on health disparities, and I open and there's a thing on allostatic load, and it was so cool to be like, wow, that seed was planted back then. As I thought about it in this systemic way, and then now I'm really thinking about it still systemically, but I'm working a little bit more. I'm working just in a different way. And so the beauty of the things that are being studied through one lens and then somatics is really bringing it in and saying, here's the tools. Here's the real,
Yeah.
here's what we need so that we can actually change this instead of just going, oh, gee, this is a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, which kind of
Yeah.
brings me to these questions of like, how do we increase our resilience
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
grapple with things like white supremacy and all the isms to show up in more right relationship with others, with self.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the the dance technology that I've been developing and have offered that you participated in at Soul Play is called Resilient Body. And it's it's a trauma-informed dance journey that is designed to help uh, the the privileged body um, build more resilience to be in the discomfort of challenging that, right? Build some more of the resilience from this fragility. And so it's an embodiment practice, a dance practice, because it's about not just recruiting the body's like strength, resilience, resource, wisdom, but about working with this kind of place in the nervous system that we each go when we're confronted with something unfamiliar or something that either like triggers our trauma or like edges us towards it. And how do we work with that edge and bring more resource to it, and in that way expand our window of tolerance or our ability to stay in regulation during these stressful or uncomfortable moments. um, and again, I'll quote Resma Menachem here. um, uh, One of the trainings I did with him was actually like 2 days before I brought Resilient Body to Soul Play in 2022, which was, I think, like the first time I offered this dance journey. And he was working with, it was a mixed race space, but he was talking to the white folk and he was like, can you feel the edge between peril and possibility?
Mm.
And that's exactly the place where we build the resilience, right? And so I've found it in myself, and I'm in the resilient body practice, I'm bringing people into a state where they can be on that line, on that edge for themselves, where I'm safe enough that I can think about possibility, right? There's that autonomy and safety thing, dance that we were talking about before. I'm safe
Mm-hmm.
enough that I can be in my creativity, my imagination, my possibility. But I'm also including in that this part of me that feels in absolute peril.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually not absolute peril happening, but that's how trauma works, right? It
Yep.
recalls the time when the peril was happening, and it's like it's happening right now in the body, right? And so in this dance practice, we're building resources within ourselves and in community with each other to be on that edge of peril and possibility.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. I think that that dance, that line between those two is where the big transformation happens. Because we can't face the peril if we don't have possibility. And if we're just in
Yeah,
possibility, we're usually not actually solving the problems that need to be solved.
right, right.
And,
We're not in full reality.
yep. Yeah. Mm,
Yeah, and I think there's a really important aspect of doing this work together, doing this work in
mhm,
community, right? And I mean, like we already talked about, like what does it mean to do this work in community in a society that like really does not make it easy for us to be in community long term, really. Like we have like the reason why these festivals and one of the reasons why these festivals and retreats are so popular is because we're all craving that community. We cannot figure out how to do it long term. Like who's got like $2 million to buy land and like build houses on for all your friends? Because I've had that dream for a long time with some of my friends, right? But it's like
mhm.
the current economic system is making that really challenging for the vast majority of us.
Yeah, I actively have that dream, and I live in a place where a lot of people have that dream, and it feels just out of reach. And especially if you are not, a techie who's making a shit ton of money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I'm wondering if kind of our last bit of discussion here could be around that question of interdependence versus
Mm-hmm.
maybe hyper independence and that codependence and
Yeah.
those sort of three different buckets that we can often find ourselves dancing between. And maybe most of us are
Mm-hmm.
not ever in that interdependence bucket.
Yeah, I think that one of the big focuses for me in my deprogramming from white supremacy and colonizer mentality is um, being in the question, what does it mean to be interdependent? Like, what does that actually look and feel like? And I think the important thing here is to assume that I actually don't know inherently because it's not been reflected in my upbringing in culture, right? There's very few places where we can turn to and be like, oh, that's interdependence. So
Hmm.
being in the question is a way of kind of inviting in that wisdom that, you know, if we had a deeper relationship with land and place, we might be able to witness that happening in nature, right? Like we might be able to like really let that wisdom in that like it's kind of a truth of the planet that we live on that we're not relating to, right?
Hmm.
Um yeah, as a recovering codependent myself, I think I had to learn this was a hard lesson to learn that like codependence, all different ways of being codependent are actually inherently manipulative. It's codependence exists from a belief structure that um my needs and benefit, my needs and boundaries are not okay, not acceptable.
Mm,
And so then I have
mhm,
to, rather than just show up authentically, first, step one, know what those needs and boundaries are, which we already talked about. That's hard, right? Step two, show up authentically in our relationships and be honest about what the needs and boundaries are. Step three, that person doesn't judge them or tell us that they're wrong or that we're bad because of them, right? We got a lot of work to do. So I think
mhm,
with codependence, it's like I'm doing a whole song and dance either internally by myself or in relation to another human, or both at the same time, that is really in essence an argument that I'm having with myself around whether my needs and boundaries are valid just the way they are.
mhm. Yeah.
And one of the things that I've sort of come to really see in all of my work with couples is like in codependence, there's a fundamental belief that we can't both get what we need at the same time.
Mhm.
And if I'm giving you what you need, that's inherently going to drain me, right? So it's like this
Yeah.
belief that like the giving is this expenditure, or is this like drain, or is this sacrifice, or is this burden? And it's like it is when it's in a codependent dynamic, but when it's in an interdependent dynamic, there's actually something that Stantakin calls uh, interactive regulation, right?
Mm,
We are both, it's not me, co-regulation, um, like is not just, it's not just like me regulating you and then you're regulating, okay, now
mhm,
you regulate me. It's interactive. We are both able to offer regulation and receive at the same time.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I agree with what you had started with saying is just that nature can be a way in which we can actually look and see examples of interdependence that are really hard to see in this human society because we've,
Yeah.
squashed most of it. Um, and for me, I've learned the most from nature and really saying, wow, every living thing here plays its part and it gives and it takes and it's all reciprocal, and actually none of this can exist without the other. And and I love the part where um I don't know if you said this or if my brain just said it, but uh, I think my brain said it, is this idea that like I can communicate my needs and desires and I can actually be okay with you not being able to meet them
Yep.
versus I need you to meet them. Like or I don't have other people I can look to. I can't look to them myself, or it's not even okay. Or, just all of that. But also, like you said, it takes knowing your needs and desires. It takes, and just there's so much work here. And I really believe this is a lifelong process. And for some people, it's, even just like that nourishment, like, can you actually receive the deep care of others? Can you receive rather than not just give because it gives that external validation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
Right. Right. All of this stuff is
mm,
simple but not easy, you know. It's
hmm
not even that simple. It's pretty
hmm
complex sometimes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And all of it is, yes, you can have work, whether in therapy, in a workshop, in a course, listening to a podcast like this where you get a light bulb and you feel differently, but it is that continual sensing, feeling, communicating, building those skills, riding that edge of peril and impossibility of expanding that window of tolerance, and that over time then it does become easier. And there are ways in which, like I'm personally experiencing, um a really beautiful romantic relationship. And it's because of the years of struggle and the years of facing my anxious attachment and the years of being like, how do I ask for what I need? How do I know what I need? And like all of that. And
Yeah.
and yet all of a sudden the right person, the right time, the skills, the awarenesses have kind of solidified in your system, and it can be different, and you will still have rupture and you will still get triggered, and all of that will still happen because we are humans, and it's going to happen till we die.
And it's not a problem that it's happening, right?
No.
It's like, yeah, I mean, you're saying like you're experiencing this like new level in your romantic relationships and your romantic relating, and that part of your learning is like, oh, I can ask for a need and it's okay if that doesn't get met, right? Like that's totally part of the journey. And like also like my version of that is like knowing that I don't need to stick around if my needs and boundaries aren't being respected over and over and over and over again, or even just like a little bit. Like I just said goodbye to a very casual thing where I was like very brief, and I was like, I don't want to teach you how to respect women. Not my job,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And like,
Nope.
but again, the thing is the same. It's like I'm no longer hooked into needing you to do something for me. It's like, oh, you're not doing that thing for me? Okay, bye. Like, actually,
Yep.
writing on the wall, those are a couple of red flags. And I'm not like, that's enough information that I don't need to stick around to hope that you change or do it
Mm-hmm.
differently, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the need to have someone else offer that to me is finally less than the need, the ability I have to offer it to myself.
Yep.
But the needs don't necessarily go away because we're social human. Like, it's not about not having needs. It's
Mm-hmm.
about being in right relationship with the needs and being able to be in a negotiating process with whoever you're relating to that
Mm-hmm.
actually works for the two people.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And to go back to the nervous system, um, it sounds like you were able to, instead going into this sympathetic, into this fawning, into this like, oh, what can I do for you to, so you want to meet my needs? You're like, oh, you know what? I'm actually just gonna stay regulated. I don't need this. Bye. Like, thanks for the
Thank you
time
for saying
together.
that, because it's actually more complicated than that. And I forgot to say that part.
Mm.
I actually did fawn with this person, and I had a whole wave of feelings because my trauma response got nicked. But the difference is I have more regulation in my nervous system to be able to go through the wave and be like, oh, that's what that is. That was hard,
Hmm.
but like even just witnessing that, like I had that emotional wave is information for me that like that's too much work that I don't want to do. But the emotional wave itself isn't the problem. It's the information, and it's the nervous system's capacity to move through that. Whereas in previous not so healthy relationships, I would just be chronically stuck in the fawn state, right? So
Yep.
again, it's like we don't need to avoid going into these uh, stress responses. We just build the resilience to move through them quicker.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Because we will get put into those responses, and it's more about, what is this telling me about myself, about the other person, about how we're relating. And it's not to say,
Yeah.
don't be in relationship with someone who triggers you, but it's like, is there enough security? Is there enough, are we compatible? Are we able to process? Am I able to generally feel regulated and not be in one of those responses with you? And,
Hmm.
also, how do you show up when I have this response? Can you be maybe present without it triggering your shit, or, which it might, but like
Yeah.
triggering it enough where perhaps you pull away, or just like, what is this dance between us? And I've experienced that recently. I've been going through so much change, and my nervous system, it felt like every other day it was like totally constricting, totally bracing. And while I used to get stuck there, and while I used to be, oh, well, this is how the world is, nothing's working. Now I'm like, oh yeah, we're scared, aren't we? There's a lot of uncertainty happening right now, isn't there? There's a lot of change. Baby, okay, let me give you some tender care. And then guess what? I get to the other side much quicker, and I don't make it wrong that I'm in that constriction.
Yeah, that's right. Nice work.
Thank you. Yeah, I was patting myself on the back a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've covered so much ground today. Is there anything else
hmm
you feel like we haven't uncovered, that stone that you really wanted to look underneath?
Yeah, I mean, nothing in particular is coming to mind. I'm just like I'm really grateful for the opportunity to chat with you about how these different layers intersect, right? And for for me, thinking about all of these layers together, the cultural, the interpersonal, the in intrapersonal, the just me, it's it's a pathway for liberation. It's and you know, I come across some people who have a very sort of like optimistic mindset, or they're like, no, just focus on like what's good kind of thing. And now these days I, instead of just like like blanketly being like, no, we have to be in the hard stuff, I actually pause and I consider their identities, their humanity, what they've been through. Like maybe looking towards the positive is the most resilient move that they can make, right? Like I was having a conversation with somebody earlier this year as a white cis man, and he was like really excited about what he had just learned, which was like how he needs to like slow his roll about what he thinks truth is, and um and really like pause and consider like other people's truths might be different. But the way that he was so excited about it and the way he was talking about it, he was using we language. Like, yeah, we all just really need to like, you know, like not take our truth so seriously, and not like um be so firm in our beliefs, and like create some space to consider other people's whatevers. And I was like, you know, that's really good for you in your skin and your body. For me, somebody who's been acculturated and told more often than not that because I'm a woman, I don't, my like thoughts or opinions don't matter, or they matter less. I actually need to do the work to fortify my own truth, right? As somebody who's been in relationships where gaslighting has been happening, I actually need to do the work to validate my own reality more and validate other people's reality less. And that it's everything to do with my experience and my identity, right? And so it's like, everything that we've talked about today might not be everyone's cup of tea, and that's okay. It's like, if this pathway works for you, then yes. And, you know, it's not going to like being in the difficultness and being in the discomfort and being in the learning all of that may be not the right thing for you, or not the right thing for you right now, you know? But I think for the
Yeah.
vast majority of people who are holding any kind of privilege within their intersecting identities, it's really important to think about these aspects of trauma and discomfort and resilience building, and to know the difference between this isn't for me, or I'm letting myself off the hook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Am I not facing what's uncomfortable, what feels hard, or is it really not my work to do? And often the more
Yeah.
privilege you have, hate to break it to you, but there's probably more work to do. And maybe not in
Yeah.
this moment, take your
Hmm.
bite-sized pieces. We have a lifetime of work ahead of us, and certainly um, feeling like you have to figure it all right now is a sign that you're unsympathetic. So it's like, yeah, how can we
Yeah.
slow down and, how can we be in right relationship with the type of healing and awareness building that we all need to do in order for our world to have less suffering that could be avoided.
Yeah. Amen to that. Yeah.
Mm. Wow. Well, this has been such a good conversation.
Agreed. It's been such
Mm.
a pleasure.
Mm. And I know you have a practice for us, but first I want to ask
Hmm.
how folks can work with you, which there's awesome links below your website, social media, so that'll be in the show description. But what are current ways if someone was like, oh my gosh, this is the person for me?
Yeah. Well, I currently have like one or two openings for uh, a one-on-one therapy, or I'm full with couples at this time, but I've got one-on-one therapy available for California residents, or a somatic coaching program on embodied relationship. Um, so I've got one or two spots open for that currently, and that kind of changes, with time. Um, we're still working on dates, but there will be a Dance Your Medicine retreat in Costa Rica in November of 2024. Around that time, I collaborate with Ren Lafitte, who founded Co-Crea Partner Dance, and Natasha Richards, who's an amazing yoga instructor, and there may be others joining us. Uh, it's a whole retreat on dancing and right relationship that we do at this amazing center in Costa Rica. And then I'll be starting up some in-person workshops and classes in Los Angeles. Some of them will be collaborations that are too soon for me to announce or talk about in any kind of detail. But I'll be doing some, Resilient Body is going to come to LA, and also the work I do around attachment through a contact improv and embodiment lens. Those workshops will be coming. So the best way to like stay tuned with all of that is to either get on my mailing list, which you can get to from my website, or follow me on Instagram, or both.
Yeah, and I really want to plug the Soul Play Festival, which I think the main one happens in June in California, but my sense is there's other events, and you're the inclusion and co-lead for inclusion and belonging, and you facilitate, I know, a few workshops, which are just outstanding. And I will say, I've never been to a festival that put that much care into trying to make sure that folks of all identities felt like they belonged and there were processes if something happened. And, literally you come in and before you can go find your campsite, you're told all about the resources, all about consent, all about, you know, a bunch of things that I've just never experienced in that type of space. So thank you for your work there. And if folks are interested in things
Yeah.
like dance and nature and sensuality, Soul Plays for you.
Yeah. Thanks for plugging that. I can't believe I forgot that. Yeah. Soul Play is like hands down my favorite festival. And it's really exciting to see the kind of like cutting edge work we're doing around inclusion and belonging in these conscious community spaces.
Hmm. Well, I believe you have a somatic practice for us.
I do. So this is one that I call straight spine, soft front body. Um, and it's kind of connected in with a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. So will lead us in this practice that won't take too long. Let's just find a comfortable seat. Or if you prefer to do this standing, that's also an option. And so if you're seated or standing, just feeling the points of body that are in contact with the ground or the chair, kind of allowing these to be your anchor points. Feeling how your bony structure is holding you up. Feeling the density of your bones, that solidity, that strength. And how the bones are really just spiraling together under layers of muscle and fascia and skin. And see if you can really just like lean back into that structure in you. And letting that be the kind of core central place in you right now. And so as your bones are holding you up, what of your muscles can you let go? Just notice if there's any tension being held in your jaw or your shoulders, legs, arms. And so you're simultaneously feeling the structure of the bones and the suppleness of the muscles. And bringing your attention to your spinal column, and its relative straightness. We know the spine is actually a curve. And just find that kind of rightness in that curve in your spine and that uprightness, that all of those articulating bones, technically cartilage, okay? All of that is just supporting you and holding you up. And notice what stabilizing muscles in your deep core are also in the assist here, are also a part of this. And maybe feeling some muscle engagement in your back body. So there's this firm, strong stance happening from your sits bones or your feet if you're standing, all the way up your back body. This is your trueness right here. And as you're in that alignment with yourself, whatever that alignment is for you that makes you feel strong and stable, bringing your attention to your front body and letting anything that needs to soften here soften. Anything that is willing to soften. And maybe there's not a whole lot that wants to soften, and that's okay. Just notice that and see if there's one tiny place where you can soften even just 1%. Again, going to the back body, remembering that strength and alignment there. And if your eyes are closed, just flutter them open and have a soft gaze and practice this kind of soft receptiveness of receiving the information through your eyes. Not searching, but just letting the information in through the eyes, sort of soft eyeballs. I like to think of my eyeballs as being kind of rested back in their sockets. releasing tension around my eyes and head. And so feeling that softness and that strong, straight spine, back body. Anything that I filter through my eyes, through my soft front body, gets filtered through this straight spine, this alignment. And I get to feel if that works for me or not. Maybe take a look around the room a little bit and notice how that straight spine feels as you take in different things. I'm taking in my ukulele, and that enters into my back body with some sparkles and joy. If I look towards my laundry pile that hasn't been done, something different happens. Just letting that information move through you and returning back to that straight spine, that alignment, that strong back body. Yeah. Maybe just give that a little wiggle as we come out of this. Just noticing any state shift that might have happened there. Yeah. Little state shift you got there, Jaclyn.
Oh yeah, definitely softened. It felt really good to feel into my spine and where I was held, and then the other parts of me could soften.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's like, it's like, where can we find the solidity, the surety in ourselves so that we can relate with the rest of the world without all of that rigidity, right? But that it can, information from the world, we can receive it, we can be in relationship with it, but we don't collapse or get yanked around by it, right?
Yep.
There's this inner integrity that we're continuing to tend to.
Or be so braced that we can't receive it. Yeah. Oh, beautiful.
Exactly.
I will be doing that one again.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that practice and for this really rich conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me and for joining in Resilient Body and being brave and showing up to that work and continuing to show up to the work that you do.
Thank you.